Today's program is Let's Take a Walk Around the Block, a brief survey of architecture in Redlands. I should probably start out by letting you know up front what this program isn't. It's not a comprehensive inventory of architecture in Redlands by any stretch of the imagination. Everything included had to meet two criteria. The first criterion was the structure had to interest me. And the second was that we had to have photographic documentation in the library's collections. What this reveals is what historians have to wrestle with all of the time, that things must be both created and saved for historians to make use of them. This means that there are large gaps in the historical record. For example, photography costs money, which means, especially in the early decades of photography, it was limited to those who could afford it, which of course meant that lots and lots of people were left out. And as a result, that form of documentation might not exist for them. Couple that with what kinds of places and events were, quote, important enough to document, and it makes the historical record very skewed. As a result, the collections at the Smiley, like most institutions, underrepresent important aspects of our shared community. That said, we actively seek material that will help us fill those gaps. So if you or someone you know can help us, please let us know. This program came about in part because we started hearing locals talk about buildings in town, saying things like, that does or doesn't look like Redlands. This led to the question, well, what then exactly does Redlands look like? Today, I will argue that Redlands can't really be pigeonholed into any one era or architectural genre. Redlanders, like their contemporaries across Southern California, adopted the prevailing designs that were popular, although there were a couple of times that Redlands has actually been at the cutting edge of architecture. It's important to first look at what was going on here before there was a Redlands. At its most basic, structures shelter us from the natural world. We use the materials and methods that are available to us based on our environment. Here we can see a very early example of Native Americans in what would later become the area near Brookside and Tennessee Streets in Redlands. The nearby Sankey provided water, and the materials used for constructions were doubtless procured from the area. With the coming of European descended peoples to our valley in the early 1800s, new construction methods came too. The estancia of Mission San Gabriel, like the missions, built largely by indigenous labor under the paternalist direction of Franciscan priests, were constructed of adobe. These buildings were at the second estancia site, the ones you see on the screen right now, created beginning around 1830 and abandoned unfinished around 1834. Fast forward to the late 1850s, when South Carolina transplant Ben Barton purchased a big chunk of the Rancho San Bernardino, including the estancia site. Barton built a two-story brick home there in 1867, which we call the Barton Villa, and it was the first brick structure in this part of the valley. The coming of the railroads to the area in the 1870s meant that new materials could be shipped inland from all over the country. By 1883, his home was greatly enlarged with a Second Empire architectural style, including the mansard roof and its tower on top. It's also known as Napoleon III style because it was popularized beginning in France during the reign of Napoleon III. So now let's move into early Redlands into the 1880s. Ed Judson and Frank Brown got the Redlands colony going in 1881, but it wasn't until 1887 that a central business district was laid out and buildings erected. This is looking at the intersection of Orange and State Streets. One of the long-range impacts of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 was the establishment of fire limits in areas where a great density of buildings would be. For Redlands, that meant buildings constructed of brick or stone. As the town prospered, so too did its built environment. The popular styles of ornamentation during the 1890s were found on the streets of Redlands. This is the same bank at State and Orange, but with the addition of details around the entrance and windows, and most obviously, the cupola on top. These buildings immediately adjacent to that building on Orange Street represent 4 different storefronts, and you can see the really interesting brick patterns that are on the pediments above the stores. By the 1890s, Redlands was really growing a lot, and as you see from this view of State Street, taken from just west of 4th, there was a substantial scale to the community at that time. Here's one of the first houses that was built in Redlands, constructed in 1882 on West Cypress Avenue. Check out the ironwork on the Widow's Walk, the diamond pattern in the roof shingles, and the ornamentation on the porch columns. Well, once that early period came about, Redlands started to reach a level of maturity in its structures. The 1891 Academy of Music, named by Cypriot Craig, editor and publisher of the Citrograph because Mead Opera House didn't sound quite Tony enough, still stands at the corner of Orange Street and Citrus Avenue. Check out the porthole-like windows on the 3rd floor. The First National Bank of Redlands constructed this building in 1892, one of the first really substantial buildings downtown. And this is probably a good time to mention that architecture can be used to convey ideas like strength and stability for the businesses that occupy buildings. And for a fledgling community like Redlands and an industry like banking, those are very important things. Redlands, like the rest of the country, adopted Victorian design elements. You can see some of those here in the Terracina Hotel, like the porch railings and wood arches on the 2nd floor. The Terracina Hotel burned in the 1890s, and in 1929 became the site of Redlands Community Hospital. Of course, the most famous Victorian in town is the 1890 Morey Mansion, which Larry Burgess jokes has every element of Victorian architecture except maybe paddle wheels. Albert K. Smiley, here with his identical twin brother Albert, each chose Victorian style for their time of Redlands houses. The Hoskins home on Brookside was an interesting blend of Gothic revival and an Italianate style. Here's Mary Hart's home on Cajon Street, and you can see it's a very interesting design, which is now a parking lot for the Beaver Clinic. And another section of a block on Cajon Street as well. But simpler homes, like this one on East Stewart Avenue, are more the norm than the exception, and just as important as the big mansions on the hill. These are the homes where the families who did the hard work of Redlands lived. Someone still decided the dimensions, the layout of the rooms, the choice of a hipped roof instead of, say, a gabled one, the design of the turned posts on the porch, and the style of the siding. A similar home on East State Street. And what's really neat about this photo is you can see in the back to the right, Redlands High School. Here again, we see a similar design at 506 West Colton Avenue. These cottages, and those like them, form entire neighborhoods that make up the historic fabric of our early years. While simple in terms of ornamentation, the Casa Loma Hotel on Colton Avenue at Orange made use of all kinds of interesting elements, like all of the juxtaposed rectangles creating a rhythm and depth across the facades, as well as the observation towers for tourists to take in the beauty of the San Bernardino Valley. Remember that First National Bank building? Well, T.R. Griffith, its architect, was also commissioned to design A.K. Smiley Public Library, which was finished in 1898. What's particularly interesting is that this is one of those moments where Redlands was on the cutting edge of architecture. There was nothing like this around an interesting blend of styles that leans toward what would become Moorish revival. And if you want to see an outstanding execution of Moorish revival, check out William F. Holt's home on West Olive Avenue at Alvarado Street. At roughly the same time he was designing Frank Miller's Mission Inn in Riverside, architect Arthur Benton designed the Contemporary Club's clubhouse at the southeast corner of Vine and 4th Streets. Also an interesting blend of styles, this leans toward Tudor revival that was becoming popular at the time, although some Mission or Spanish colonial revival elements can be seen as well. One of the ways a town could make a statement was with its post office. After having been located in several places, in 1903, the Redlands Post Office moved into this building at the northeast corner of State and 5th Streets. The post office was located on the ground floor, with offices and a lodge hall on the 2nd and 3rd floors. The Union Bank got a brand new building on the site of the first brick building in Redlands soon after the turn of the century, decked out here for the visit of President Theodore Roosevelt in 1903. You also had slightly more modest buildings in downtown Redlands. This is Stevenson's jewelry store, located on 5th Street. And you can see that once upon a time, it actually had a 3rd story where the family lived, in addition to the ground floor office and business. Interestingly, with the bay window that comes out the front, around it are cast iron details. So you can really get a sense of the scale of downtown Redlands by the turn into the 20th century, which is very different than we know it today. View of the same intersection, but from looking down State Street instead of Orange. After we get through that period, it's like Redlands reaches the age of majority. Finally, it's 21 and it can be the things it's always wanted to be. Remember how I mentioned that architecture can be used to convey messages? When architect Norman Marish designed the 1909 administration building for the brand new University of Redlands, he absolutely knew that his building would show strength, permanence, and created a strong visual connection to ancient Greece and Rome by employing neoclassical architectural elements. This may have been a cue taken from an early US president. Thomas Jefferson clearly had those thoughts in mind when beginning the tradition of neoclassical or classical revival architecture for government buildings in Washington, D.C. For a country barely older than a decade, buildings that looked back to ancient Greece and Rome certainly made a statement. So too did the university's Acropolis on the hill. Once Redlands reaches the 1910s, things have been around long enough that the old, in some places, was giving way to the new. Redlands certainly couldn't have a train depot that was built way back in the late 1880s, so a lobbying campaign finally convinced the Santa Fe Railway that a new station was in order. So Arthur Brown Jr. of the San Francisco firm Bakewell and Brown was commissioned to design a new temple to tourism with the neoclassical depot completed in 1910. During the mid-teens, the First National Bank at the southwest corner of State and Orange was raised to make way for this neoclassical bank building. Several buildings at the northwest corner of State and Orange made way for the new La Posada in the early 1930s. A bandstand in Smiley Park, then known as the Municipal Amphitheater, became the site of the Redlands Bowl with a brand new building in 1930, designed by University of Redlands alumnus Herbert Powell, with a frieze designed by sculptor Merrill Gage. It was such a unique structure that they made up a new Latin-esque word to describe it, procellus, ostensibly meaning before the seats. The Union Bank was demolished in 1929. After all, it was almost 30 years old, to make way for a new Bank of America. During the early part of the 20th century, taste in residential architecture changed too. Kirk Field built his home in an English Tudor revival style and named it Miraflores, which seems a little odd to use a Spanish name for an English Tudor revival building. And the arts and crafts movement was in full swing in this time. There are some fantastic examples of craftsman-style homes, which was a response to the high style and extreme ornamentation of the Victorian era in Redlands, like this one on Cypress Avenue at Alvarado Street. The craftsman bungalow as a property type was born in Southern California. Other homes used elements from craftsman architecture too, like the exposed rafter tails on this home at 1203 Alta Street, which is on the corner of Alta and Western. Mission Revival architecture, which is a subset of arts and crafts, was also firmly entrenched in Redlands by the teens in the 1920s. Here you can see some of that Mission Revival architecture in new developments on Upper Buena Vista Street, in this tract that was created by Garrett Heising. It's mixed with other Tudor type as well. The Roque home on North 6th Street is a fascinating look at ornamentation. The exterior is clad with stone featuring all kinds of interesting designs inlaid. Was Redlands having a midlife crisis? During the Great Depression and Second World War, Redlands changed very little, with the exception of the creation of Highway 99 through town in the 1930s. After the war, however, things started to change a lot. Just as had happened in the 1920s and the 10s, Redlands was about to experience a transformation that would give an updated look contemporary to the time. Automobile-oriented construction, especially along main roadways like Redlands Boulevard, popped up. They often used contemporary architecture with large expanses of glass, like Burger Bar on Citrus at Redlands Boulevard, and Baker's Burgers on Redlands Boulevard at Clark. In fact, auto-oriented architecture and its important evolution in Southern California architecture is now recognized as an important property type, which led to the saving of this building when it was threatened with redevelopment a few years ago. And today, looks like that. Pretty cool. I think Redlands has the most fantastic Starbucks in the Western United States. Here you can see the Fisher Building and the Triangle. It might be a little confusing to think about now, but Cajon Street met Citrus Avenue, where the corner of the phone company building now stands, in the right foreground of this photo. The oak tree is the southwest corner of Citrus Avenue and Orange Street, because Orange Street continued one block south of Citrus at that time. All of that was re-engineered for the ease of automobile transition from Cajon onto Orange Street. This was not an uncommon sight in the 1950s through the 1970s. You can see it looking like something like this. Here it is as the bank. And of course, it's today's City Hall complex. Remember that Bank of America at State and Orange? Well, it was demolished in 1959 to make way for a new Rexall drugstore with a modernist design by local architect Claire Henry Day. Further east on State at 7th was what was a residential neighborhood became a commercial neighborhood with the construction of new buildings like the very modern Security Bank and its impressive second floor screen facing State Street. Older buildings were modernized to make them look contemporary. This is that First National Bank of Redlands building that had the big columns. And you can still see the remnants of this period of time in the facades of many buildings on East State Street today. One of the interesting outcomes of the war was the development of new materials and building techniques, like the tilt-up concrete building. When Provident Bank was completed in 1966, it won awards from the concrete industry. Bank of America built a new headquarters on West State, complete with a large glass facade, something that couldn't have been executed in the same way before the ability to manufacture large plates of glass. And modernist influenced design could be found all over, like the Redlands Plaza, designed by local architect Bob Van Roekel. Although I wish I could ask him what he was thinking with large expanses of glass facing due west. It's got to be about 150 degrees in those spaces on an August afternoon. This building at State and 6th also made use of modernist design, allowing for floor-to-ceiling glass on the corner facade. Architecture at the dear old U of R also transitioned with the times, with university architect Herb Powell, who designed the massive Georgian Revival Memorial Chapel there in the 1920s, creating modernist structures in the mid-century period like this one. Housing types changed too, with the evolution of the California ranch-style home. Family life transitioned from the neighborhood-friendly front porch to the private backyard. Land seemed plentiful, so linear, sometimes rambling, single-story homes became the norm. There was an incredible boom for housing following the war. The way residential areas were developed also transitioned, from selling individual lots and then designing a house, to the creation of several models from which to choose in an entire tract, giving these new neighborhoods a homogeneous look of sometimes nearly identical homes. Although the same elements were incorporated in custom-built houses like this one in the Country Club Estates neighborhood. The use of aluminum to frame windows and sliding doors and large plates of glass allowed increased transparency between indoors and out, blurring the lines between the two. Built-up roofs utilized tar and felt and were covered by gravel and rock for protection from the sun, and deep eaves protected the glass from a lot of direct sunlight. With the newfound prosperity for largely white middle-class Southern Californians, the backyard swimming pool was the newest symbol of status. Even public housing, like this development on Lagonia Avenue, just east of Orange Street, utilized modernist design in its execution. You can see how the windows on the street facades go all the way up to the ceiling of the front rooms. Planned residential communities were also created, where owners or residents paid a monthly fee and all of the maintenance was taken care of, making it carefree living. Architecture and design are even found in places you might not think about. Mobile homes are classified as contemporary folk architecture. These are in the Ziner Trailer Park on Judson between Sylvan Boulevard and the railroad tracks. And for this little section, I'm calling it Presto Changeo, because as people's architectural tastes changed over time, sometimes they took their buildings or homes and tried to recreate them or sort of rebrand them in the architectural language of that period. So here you have J.W. England's house on West Palm Avenue. Beautiful, big Victorian space. But the times, they changed. And it was completely redone with more of an arts and crafts feel. Or how about this one, up in Redlands Heights, sitting above Crescent Avenue? E.C. Sterling bought this home, but perhaps it was not grand enough because it was rebuilt as this Italianate wonder that they named La Casada. Or how about Benton Johnson's home on West Palm Avenue at the corner with Center Street? Here you can see that massive tower and even the one on the carriage house in the background. And here's how it changed to be a much more simple structure by the mid-century period. Do you remember this series of buildings on Orange Street, just north of State? Well, it got rebranded and all of those facades were unified into a single storefront. And then just for that point of comparison, here's that First National Bank. And by the 1960s, as things moved toward contemporary and more modern looks, Art Gregory Jr. told me that they got out big jackhammers and jackhammered off all of those columns so that they could make it this contemporary building. Of course, that was demoed in the 1970s to make way for a parking lot at the Redlands Mall. Or how about this building, which is on East Citrus Avenue on the north side of the street, which got its makeover during the mid-century period and has even since been made over with a brick facade once again. Or perhaps my favorite sort of remaking, rebranding, here are the ruins of the Estancia buildings, which became what we know today as the Asistencia. And the last little example here is Jenny Davis' home, which was on Brookside Avenue, almost to Tennessee Street on the north side. Her whole estate there, which was named the Alders for the trees which grew along the Sankey. When that area was going to be developed into apartments and a strip mall, the house was picked up and moved to Rialto, where subsequent owners made it this. So back to that question, what does Redlands look like? As was mentioned at the beginning, every generation of Redlanders has utilized the architecture of its time to express the built environment. Redlands has really been making and remaking itself for its entire history. So I hope you can see that Redlands can't be pigeonholed into just one era or one architectural style. It is many things in many eras, and each is important to understanding the history and evolution of our community. In the last few years, there have been some remarkable additions to our landscape, like building Q at Esri. And there's more to come with the Museum of Redlands. Thank you.